In late 2001, a church pastor in Texas named Jim Fox was concerned about one of the members of his congregation. It was a man who actually worked part-time at the church and who recently had started behaving strangely. Jim had known this guy for years, and he had always been pretty hard-headed. This often led to friction between them, but over the past few days, suddenly he had become very withdrawn and no longer seemed to have strong opinions about anything. When Jim asked him what was going on, the man told him this weird story about a big storm that had happened in the area and how he believed it was God trying to get his attention. But none of it really appeared to explain the sudden shift in his personality. It wasn't until a couple of days later that Jim and everyone else in the church community would begin to learn the truth about what was going on. Right during the middle of another one of their conversations, police would show up at Jim's house and take this man out in handcuffs. It turned out that he had been hiding an incredibly dark and incredibly disturbing secret. In November of 2001, it looked like things couldn't have been going better for 43-year-old Diane Holik. She was adored by her friends and family, she had a good and fulfilling job, and she was preparing to start a new chapter of her life. Diane was originally from New York State, but in the mid-1990s she had moved to Austin, Texas. At the time, she was going through a divorce, so when she got the opportunity to relocate for work, it seemed like a good place for a fresh start. This turned out to be a great decision. Diane immediately fell in love with the city and bought a beautiful house in the affluent Great Hills neighborhood, located in the north of Austin. Though Diane lived by herself, she had a very full life. For starters, she was a workaholic. After finishing college, she had gotten a job with IBM as a programmer and had been with the company ever since. She developed a reputation there not only for her impeccable work, but for her obvious skills as a people person. It was partially for this reason that she ended up being part of a team that managed new employees, normally ones that had been hired directly out of college. When she wasn't traveling for work, Diane could usually be found in her home office getting ready for her next conference call. It could be hectic, but she was the kind of person that loved being challenged. Outside of work, Diane kept herself just as busy. She had a large group of friends and was very outgoing. She loved country western dancing, hosting wine tasting parties with her neighbors, and everywhere she went, she was great at meeting new people. Arguably, the only thing Diane liked more than people was animals. She was a member of the charity organization known as Paws and had 2 dogs of her own named Rocky and Baylor. Those close to Diane said that she treated her dogs like her children, and any given day could be seen walking them around the neighborhood. I said before that Diane was getting ready to start a new chapter of her life, and that's because earlier that same year, she had gotten engaged to a man named Dennis Conley. They had been introduced through a dating service and had immediately fallen for one another. Dennis had proposed just a couple of months after they met, and Diane accepted. When Diane's friends heard about this, initially they were very surprised. Diane was so independent, it just sort of came out of nowhere. That being said, they could tell Diane was really excited. Dennis had given her this really beautiful platinum and diamond ring when he popped the question, and from the moment she said yes, Diane had basically never taken it off her finger. There was one thing that was kind of an issue, and that was the fact that Dennis lived in Houston. Diane had agreed to move there because she could basically work from anywhere, but it meant that she would need to sell her house. This was easier said than done because at the time, the Austin real estate market wasn't doing so well. Things were slow and there just weren't a ton of buyers. Being the proactive person that she was, though, Diane wasn't going to let that stand in the way of her happiness. She hired one of her neighbors, who was also a real estate agent, to help her out, and she was feeling optimistic. Besides, the wedding was still a little ways down the road, so she had some time. In the meantime, Diane was looking forward to an upcoming vacation and just the holiday season in general, as she had planned to spend Thanksgiving with Dennis. Unfortunately, none of this was going to work out the way that she had hoped. What Diane didn't know was that there was a hidden threat lurking somewhere in these seemingly normal details of her life, one that neither she nor anyone else saw until it was too late. On the afternoon of November 16th, 2001, Austin police were contacted by a woman named Tina Fountain. Tina said that she was calling from Illinois, but that she was concerned about one of her colleagues at IBM, Diane Holik. Tina explained that Diane had missed a 10 a.m. conference call that morning with two of her coworkers, and that no one at the company had been able to reach her since. She said this was extremely out of character for Diane, who worked from home and had never missed a meeting like this before. Police agreed to go and check on Diane, but not just because of this phone call. You see, the previous day, there had been a huge storm in the region. The Austin area had been dumped with 15 inches of rain within the span of only a couple of hours. This had led to serious flooding, and on top of this, there were high winds and tornadoes that had touched down in multiple places. It was the kind of thing where a lot of people had been sort of calling around to check in with friends and relatives, and police had already received a number of these kinds of requests. When officers arrived at Diane's place, it was about 5:30 p.m., and at the beginning, it looked like it was just going to be another routine call. The front door was locked, all of the other doors and windows appeared to be properly secured, and there were no obvious signs of damage from the storm. That being said, there was no answer when they knocked at the door either, other than the sounds of Diane's two dogs, which could be heard barking inside. As officers walked around the property, they were approached by Diane's neighbor, Lackey Brown. Lackey asked what was going on, and when she was told that they were there doing a welfare check, she explained that she was Diane's real estate agent and offered to let them in. They accepted, and she opened up the front door with her key. Walking around the ground floor of the home, things were much the same that they had been outside, in the sense that everything was orderly and nothing appeared to be out of place or missing. The only weird thing was that Diane's dogs, Rocky and Baylor, had gone to the bathroom on the floor, so it was clear that they hadn't been let out recently. Upon making their way upstairs, police again didn't really see anything that jumped out to them. They were getting ready to go, actually, when one of the officers decided to double back to one of the guest bedrooms. The officer had already peeked his head in, but he realized that he wouldn't have necessarily been able to see the other side of the bed that was in there. He was about to be proven right in the most awful way imaginable. As soon as the officer headed to that side of the bed, he could see that there was something tucked underneath that had been sort of wrapped in the comforter. When he pulled up the blanket, he discovered that it was Diane. Diane was lying face down on the carpet, and it was clear that she was dead. It was also clear that this was no accident. There were ligature marks on her neck, indicating that she had been strangled. When detectives from the Austin Police Department arrived, they immediately got to work trying to piece together what had happened. Obviously, the manner and cause of Diane's death weren't really that hard to figure out, but suspects and motives, that was a different story. And as they would soon find out, the scene didn't provide a lot of clues. Forensics teams scoured the home for DNA and fingerprints, but they came up with almost nothing. Even Diane's own fingerprints were hard to find, indicating that the killer might have wiped down items and surfaces that they had touched. If true, it was also a pretty disturbing sign that the killing had been pre-planned. Another sign of potential premeditation came when detectives took a closer look at Diane's body. Though there were some injuries to her face and stomach, these looked like carpet burns from when she had been dragged over to the side of the bed. There were no wounds consistent with a struggle, which they thought was strange until they saw Diane's wrists. Just like on her neck, there were marks here too, suggesting that her hands had been bound when she was murdered. The marks were fairly thin, with investigators guessing the killer had used zip ties or a pair of flex cuffs to secure her hands. In other words, the perpetrator had come prepared. Speaking of Diane's hands, the other thing detectives noticed was that her $17,000 engagement ring was missing. There was a mark on her finger from where she normally wore the ring, and by this point, Lackey had already mentioned that Diane had a fiancé from Houston who she often went to visit on the weekends. The ring wasn't the only thing missing. A keepsake box, as well as other small pieces of jewelry, were gone, but the engagement ring was by far the most expensive item. Due to the value of the ring, robbery had to be considered a potential motive. However, investigators weren't fully convinced. After all, if financial gain was what the killer was after, why had they left behind all the other valuables inside of Diane's house? This included things that would have been way easier and more useful to steal, such as the sizable amount of cash in Diane's purse. At the same time, there was no other obvious motive either. Diane was fully clothed when she was found, so the crime didn't appear to be a sexual assault. Perhaps then, the person who took Diane's ring wanted it for something other than its monetary value. This tied into something else, which was how the killer had actually gotten into Diane's house in the first place. Remember, all the doors and windows were found locked, so even if Diane had let them into her home willingly, they would have had to have used a key to lock up behind them when they left. This led to a pretty unnerving conclusion, which is that Diane might have been killed by someone very close to her. As it happened, some of Diane's friends had their suspicions about who might be responsible. Someone who fit this description exactly. While continuing to process the crime scene, Austin police began speaking to Diane's loved ones. As I mentioned earlier, she was originally from New York, so most of her family was on the other side of the country. As a result, some of the first people to be interviewed were Diane's friends who lived in the Austin area. A number of these close friends said that they had also been trying to contact Diane on the day her body was found. They had reached out to her after the big storm to check in, but she never got back to them. They were blindsided and devastated when they learned what had happened, but at the same time, they said they had concerns about one person in particular, Diane's fiancé, Dennis Conley. Multiple friends told police that Diane's relationship with Dennis had always seemed a bit off. From the very beginning, there was all this excitement and love, and Dennis was buying her all these expensive gifts. It was very over the top. And with the engagement coming so soon after they met, it started to feel like he was rushing her into something that she didn't want. At first, Diane was very much caught up in the whirlwind, but her friend stated that after a while she started to question whether she was really ready to get married again. They said her doubts only grew when Dennis began to exhibit some pretty controlling behavior. They explained that Dennis didn't like her going out with them at all. This often led to fights between them, since, this was a huge part of her life. Diane worried that if she married Dennis, she would lose her independence and would be isolated, especially because she was already planning to move 3 hours away to a new city to be with him. Speaking of the move, there was another huge red flag as far as the friends were concerned, which is that Dennis didn't like Diane's dogs. In fact, he wanted her to get rid of them before the wedding. Obviously, Diane was never going to do this, but all the same, the fact that he would even ask only made her question the relationship more. Friends said that just a few days before Diane's murder, she and Dennis had had another fight, and she confided in them that she was thinking about not going forward with the wedding. This was all very interesting to detectives in and of itself, but they became even more focused on Dennis when they listened to the voicemails on Diane's answering machine. By this point, investigators had learned Diane had last been heard from the afternoon before her body was found on November 15th. Like her friends, Dennis had left a bunch of messages for Diane during this period, but his stuck out. To detectives, he didn't sound concerned so much as he sounded annoyed and angry. Here are a couple of excerpts from those messages.
Sorry, you better not be sleeping. Hey, you, if I don't hear from you in about an hour, I'm calling the freaking police. I have to go by your house, okay? If I don't hear from you, I'm going to have to drive over there and find out what the hell's going on here. So call me. Diane, what is going on? Give me a call. You have me worried to death. Bye.
Immediately after being contacted about what had happened, Dennis drove down to Austin to meet with investigators. During that interview, he acknowledged that there were problems with his and Diane's relationship. However, he denied having anything to do with the murder. He said that they were in couples therapy and that they had been trying to work on things.
I mean, we don't fight. It's just, everybody carries baggage into your relationships at this age, and our baggage was clashing, and we were working on it, but we decided not to be engaged anymore.
In terms of an alibi, Dennis claimed that he'd been in Houston working on a big presentation he was supposed to give at his company. He said he'd been up late finishing it, and that this had taken up pretty much all of his time between November 15th and 16th. Detectives weren't sure they believed Dennis, and they thought his alibi was weak. He would have had more than enough time to kill Diane and drive back to Houston before the crime was discovered, and he also had a key to her house. They theorized that maybe he left the voicemails as a way of covering up his involvement. Also, there was the matter of the engagement ring. Obviously, Dennis was the one that bought it for Diane, so if her calling off the wedding was part of the motive, that could potentially explain why it was missing. Maybe he had taken it. Still, investigators couldn't ignore what Dennis said next. He stated that he had his own suspect, a friend and coworker of Diane's, named Ray.
Ray is a very dysfunctional person from my standpoint, in the fact that he seems to be attracted to women that are not attracted to him.
So you think he pretty much is obsessed with her?
Honestly, if I was a woman, he would give me the creeps.
According to Dennis, Ray was clearly in love with Diane, though she pretended not to see it. He was always coming over to her house, doing favors for her, and would buy her gifts and flowers. Crucially, Dennis explained that Ray also had a key to Diane's place. Since she traveled a lot, she often needed someone to look after her dogs, and Ray always seemed to volunteer. Not only that, but he would even clean for Diane. This last detail caught the attention of detectives because, remember, they already believed that the killer had wiped down a bunch of surfaces and items to avoid leaving behind evidence. Ray was not only someone with access to Diane's home, but he probably would have felt comfortable hanging around there and would have been familiar with where he needed to clean. Ray was likewise brought in for an interview, and to the surprise of detectives, was very open about his affections for Diane. He said he was in love with her and that he did all those favors and errands to get her attention. His hope was basically that if he stuck around long enough, she would develop the same feelings in return. However, Ray also said he wasn't in denial. He had eventually come to terms with the fact that his plan was never going to work, and that they were never going to be more than friends. He claimed he had made peace with this, and he didn't have any negative feelings towards Diane.
People say you might have had a little crush on her.
Diane? Oh, hell yeah. For sure. Never even kissed her.
Never even. Do you want to?
Always wanted to, never did.
As honest as Ray seemed, investigators had to wonder if it was all an act. Perhaps Ray had gotten tired of Diane ignoring his advances, and he had killed her out of rejection and anger. Ray denied any involvement and said that he would never hurt Diane. Interestingly, he pointed the finger right back at Dennis, saying that he had a bad temper and didn't think he was good for her. Ray also had a nearly identical alibi to Dennis, saying that he had been working late between November 15th and 16th. At this point, it appeared that detectives had two equally plausible suspects. What they needed now was something concrete pointing to either one of them. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for when they were notified about an important development. So, I told you before that there was essentially no physical evidence found inside Diane's house. However, there was one exception. There was a green towel that had been found on a couch in her living room. Caught in the fibers of the towel were a handful of human hairs. None of these hairs had roots attached, so authorities were limited in the kinds of testing that they could do. Fortunately, though, it was still enough that they could perform some DNA analysis between the hairs and the samples that they had collected from Dennis and Ray during their interviews. Before long, detectives had the results. So, you're probably wondering, was it Dennis or was it Ray? Well, it turned out it was neither of them. Both men were excluded by the DNA testing. Needless to say, this was a pretty big blow to detectives who were faced with the prospect of having to start their investigation from the beginning. As it happened, though, they wouldn't be in this position for long. They were about to get a new piece of information, one that revealed something extremely important that up until now, they had been missing. After the setback with the DNA evidence, Austin police knew they were in a tough spot. Worried that the case was starting to get away from them, they decided to head back to the crime scene and see if there was anything that maybe they hadn't paid enough attention to the first time. As soon as they pulled up, it was staring them right in the face. The for sale sign right outside of Diane's house. It gave them an idea. Acting on a hunch, detectives started walking around the neighborhood and began speaking with other residents who also had their houses up for sale. As I said before, the real estate market wasn't great at the time, so there were actually quite a few houses that had been listed that were just sitting there that hadn't moved. It wasn't long before a very unsettling pattern emerged. A number of women who owned these houses said that they had had a strange experience recently with an unknown man. This man had shown up unannounced at their homes, saying that he was looking to move to the area and was interested in buying. The man told them that he had just sold a ranch property he owned, so he was able to pay in cash. He also asked them if he could come in and have a look around. Almost all of these women said that they had instantly gotten a weird vibe from this guy. The prospect of a cash offer was very tempting, but there was just something off about this man, so they had refused to let him in. On top of this, all of these interactions had happened during the middle of the day when they were home alone. One woman had let the man in, though. Her name was Christine Choate, and she told investigators she had immediately come to regret her decision. Unlike the other women police spoke with, Christine was a realtor who had experience listing homes and doing tours, so she felt a little more comfortable allowing a stranger into her home like this. Even so, things quickly got creepy. Christine said that despite the man's insistence about doing the house tour right there and then, he didn't seem all that interested in what she was saying or showing him once they were inside. Well, that was with the exception of the bedroom. The man kept asking her if he could see the upstairs bedrooms. At first, Christine just tried to ignore this, but when the man started asking her if she lived alone, she knew she needed to get him out. She quickly made something up, told him he needed to leave, and said that if he gave her his contact info, she would set up another time with him to finish later. Thankfully, the man left, but Christine said she was left shaken by the whole thing. She said she wasn't sure what this guy was after, but it wasn't a house. When detectives asked Christine for the unknown man's contact information, they discovered that it was made up. The man had given her a fake name, Walter Miller, and the phone number he provided belonged to a random person. As if all of this wasn't unnerving enough, all of the interactions that Christine and the other women had with the man were on November 15th, the last day Diane Holik was heard from. Investigators already felt like they were on the right track when they received another alarming piece of information. Remember how Diane had missed that conference call on November 16th? Well, as it happened, one of the people that was supposed to be on that call had actually spoken to Diane the day prior. The woman's name was Cynthia Barajas, and the story she told investigators gave them chills. Cynthia said that she had been on the phone with Diane around 12:30 that afternoon, and that Diane was very excited. She said that she was pretty sure she had just sold her home. Diane explained that a guy had randomly shown up at her house saying he was looking for a new place for him and his wife. He claimed that he could pay in cash and that his wife was going to come down to Austin on the weekend, but in the meantime, he wanted to scout out a few places for himself. Diane said that she told the guy that she was busy at the moment, but they had set up a time for him to come back later that same afternoon. Understandably, these details were eerily similar to what police had already heard from the other women that they had spoken to. When they asked them what the man looked like, they all gave the same description, specifically mentioning his unusually prominent nose. Using this, detectives had a composite sketch created, which was released to the public and the media. Almost as soon as the image aired on the news, calls started pouring in. Calls from other women in and around the Austin area who described nearly identical run-ins with this same man. What was really scary was that some of these interactions had happened as far back as 6 months ago. In the end, detectives would speak to at least 14 different women who shared their experiences, but 2 of these encounters in particular stood out. One was with a woman named Tammy Cranford. The other was with a woman named Jonna Ramirez. Tammy told investigators that when the unknown man showed up at her house, she had just gotten her 2 young children down for a nap. She let him in and handed him a flyer with information about the listing for her house, but he didn't really seem all that interested. Instead, he started following her around and asking her questions about whether she had a husband or boyfriend he could speak to. At some point, Tammy's 19-month-old son woke up, and she went into his room to get him. She turned around to see the man standing there, just staring and not saying anything. Tammy said he was sweaty, shaking, and had a very strange look in his eye. It was almost as if he had become a different person. Thankfully, Tammy said she had her Great Dane in the house, and when she let him out, the man seemed to back off. He ended up leaving shortly after. Jonna Ramirez said that she had never let the man into her home, but that he had shown up multiple times right after her husband left for work. When she refused him entry and suggested that he call her real estate agent to set up a proper tour, she said the man became noticeably irritated. The second time this happened, on November 5th, Jonna stated that she was weirded out enough by the man's demeanor that she wrote down his license plate information. She said he was driving a champagne-colored Ford Windstar minivan. This last detail was the crucial bit of information that detectives needed. They looked up the license plate that Jonna had written down, and it came back registered to a 38-year-old man named Patrick Russo. Police obtained a photo of Patrick and created a lineup which they showed to all of the women they had spoken with. Almost every one of them easily picked Patrick out. At first glance, Patrick Russo didn't look like the kind of guy who would be capable of a brutal crime like this. When police tracked him down at his home in Bastrop County, about 30 miles outside of Austin, he seemed like a normal and loving father and husband. This is certainly what detectives were told by Patrick, as well as several of those close to him that they interviewed. They admitted that, yeah, Patrick had his issues when he was younger, but that was all in the past. These days, Patrick was married, was taking care of his kids, and was deeply involved in his local church. He worked there part-time as a musical director, and on the side was chasing dreams of becoming a professional musician with his Christian rock band, Broken Silence. During conversations with investigators, Patrick admitted he'd had previous run-ins with the law and had even served prison time, but he said that was all related to his terrible childhood, and that he had since turned his life around after finding God. In fact, he'd even written an autobiography about his experiences, which he had self-published. The book shared a name with his band and was titled Broken Silence, The Journey of an Abused Child, Gang Member, Drug Addict, Convict, and Born-Again Christian. When questioned about Diane, Patrick denied any wrongdoing. He said that on November 15th, he hadn't been anywhere near her neighborhood, and instead claimed he'd been on his way to a local radio station. He stated he needed to drop off some stuff there and talk about a website for his band who had released an album the previous year. Some of what Patrick said was backed up by his friends and members of his church community. They said that he was someone who had struggled as a young man, but who had since gotten his life back on track. However, it turned out that a lot of them really didn't know the whole story. So, I already said that Patrick spent time in prison, but I didn't tell you what he spent time in prison for. And as we'll see, these details are pretty important. Between 1989 and 1992, Patrick was accused of attacking at least 5 different women. Not only that, but the assaults were eerily similar to what had happened to Diane Holik. In each of the cases, the victims' hands were bound and they were strangled. The similarities didn't stop there, though. Several of the victims had been attacked in apartments while Patrick was posing as a potential renter. The women all said that during the attacks, they were sure that Patrick was going to kill them. However, for some reason, he had always stopped midway through, either because someone had shown up or because he just seemed to come to his senses and run away. In 1993, Patrick had been sentenced to 20 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping and 2 other charges related to a couple of these incidents. However, he had been released in late 1999. Needless to say, when detectives learned all of this, they were confident that they had the right person, but they still needed evidence to back up their suspicions. When they dug into Patrick's alibi, it immediately fell apart. Employees at the radio station where Patrick said he had been on November 15th stated that they hadn't seen him, and cell records placed him in the vicinity of Diane Holik's neighborhood that afternoon. Moreover, some of the leaders at Patrick's church came forward and stated he'd been acting strangely since that day. The pastor of the church, Jim Fox, said that Patrick was normally quite opinionated and that there had actually been sort of a power struggle going on between them. But lately he'd been quiet and sullen. When Jim asked Patrick about this, he said that God had revealed something to him during that big thunderstorm. He claimed he was ready to submit to the pastor's authority and would no longer cause any problems. The strongest pieces of evidence against Patrick, though, came when investigators tested his DNA against the hair found on the towel in Diane's living room. He could not be excluded as the contributor of the DNA. In addition to this, detectives were able to obtain that flyer from Tammy Cranford that she said the unknown man had touched when he came into her home. A fingerprint on the flyer was a match to Patrick Russo. As for the whole thing with the key that had been used to lock Diane's home, that turned out to be a bit of a red herring. Investigators learned that Diane kept a spare key in her back door. So after she had let the killer inside, all they would have had to do was take that key and lock up behind them. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Patrick killed Diane, but what was the motive? Well, that was by far the most unsettling part. You see, Patrick had one more extremely disturbing secret. When investigators executed a search warrant at Patrick's home on November 21st, one of the things they took into evidence was his computer. While searching it, they discovered that he had a membership to a website called necrobabes.com. The website was dedicated to people with asphyxiation fetishes and featured photos of women staged to look like they had been strangled and killed. At least 1,200 of these images would be recovered from Patrick's computer, and his internet history revealed that he had visited the site within 2 days of Diane's murder. Following his arrest, Patrick was charged with capital murder, meaning that if convicted, he could face the death penalty. At his trial in early 2004, the prosecution argued that for months leading up to the murder, Patrick had methodically searched for potential victims while simultaneously working up the nerve to carry out his fantasies. They said that he had finally done this on November 15th, 2001, when Diane Holik allowed him into her home. By this point, Patrick had meticulously planned and prepared for the crime, so he had known how to cover his tracks. They theorized that after binding and strangling Diane, he had done his best to clean up the scene. He had even managed to lock up behind himself using a spare key that Diane kept in the back door of the house, but he had forgotten one crucial thing: a towel that Diane had likely offered him to use to dry off when he first came in from the rain. As for Diane's engagement ring and the jewelry, they stated that he had likely taken them intending to keep them as trophies, but later discarded them out of fear. Patrick's defense team argued that the evidence against him was thin and that prosecutors hadn't proven their case, but it was enough to convince the jury. In the end, Patrick was convicted of capital murder, though they opted to give him life in prison instead of a death sentence. While this meant that Patrick would have been eligible for parole after 40 years, because he was already on parole for serious crimes at the time of the killing, the judge ruled that the sentences would run consecutively. As a result, he would have to serve the remaining 13 years of his 20-year sentence before the capital murder sentence would start. At the time of this recording, Patrick Russo remains incarcerated. He will not be eligible for parole until 2057, when he is 93 years old. I'll keep this segment short because I think I've pretty much covered everything, though I did want to briefly talk about what I think is the scariest part of this whole thing. And that's just how close Patrick Russo came to getting away with all of this. You know, if it weren't for that critical mistake with the towel, it's possible that even with the circumstantial evidence against him, he might not have been convicted. Based on his history and the alarming pattern of behavior he displayed with all those other women, I think it's reasonable to argue that he would have kept doing this. So, arguably, police caught a serial killer in the making. This appears to be one of the few things that Diane's friends and family were able to find comfort in. The idea that there could finally be peace for Patrick's other victims and that they no longer had to live in fear. Of course, this is hardly a silver lining when you consider that at the end of the day, Diane still lost her life over this. A life that should have been filled with so many more memories, so many more experiences, and so many more adventures. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, Thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.